Thank you, Annette. All right, maybe give folks just a couple more seconds to join. We are right at 8:30, and I want to make sure that we respect our wonderful special guest time. Once again, welcome to this morning's coffee chat. We have two very special guests and a team of incredibly talented staff to help highlight the conversation on infrastructure, specifically the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and some of the great work that has been done in the other Washington this past year. So as we get started, I would first like to introduce Congressman Rick Larson. Oh, sorry, I jumped the gun once again. Here is a list of our wonderful panelists. We have Congressman Rick Larson in the second CD, Congresswoman Susan DelBene in the first CD, Sean Garcia, Senior Legislative Assistant, and Paul Roberts with Representative Larson's office. So I will kick things off here by first introducing Congressman Rick Larson, who represents the Washington 2nd Congressional District, including parts of Snohomish, Skagit, Whatcom counties, and all of San Juan counties. He's a senior member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and the Armed Services Committee. On these committees, he focuses on creating jobs and opportunity to meet the local needs of Washingtonians. Congressman Larson supported the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which delivers historic investments in the state's infrastructure and creates more jobs, drives economic recovery and growth, and helps build a cleaner, greener, and safer transportation network. And with that, I will kick it over to Congressman Larson for opening remarks.
Thanks, Misha. Sound okay? Great, good. And then also with me, because I have to leave at 8:45 for a 9 o'clock meeting on infrastructure. Paul Roberts is on the panel. Many of you know Paul, but he works for me now, and he's a transportation infrastructure coordinator in my office in Everett, specifically for, he works part-time, but specifically on transportation and infrastructure, trying to bring these dollars back to the North Puget Sound. And then he may or may not show up. Sean Garcia is on my staff in Washington, D.C. I understand he and his daughter are sharing an illness, and so he may not be on the call this morning. But I want to start off by first just letting folks know that last week I was in two NATO countries, specifically visiting the airmen, sailors, and soldiers who are serving there, and had an opportunity to meet many of them who are from our state, from Oroville up in north central Washington to a guy from Osoton County who's soon to get out, a pilot from Bellevue, some folks from two folks from Port Angeles, working in two different areas of NATO countries. And I'm surprised to run into two people from Port Angeles. I want to bring that up because these are the young women and men of the country and of our state who are working on what we call the defense and deterrence mission that NATO is currently undertaking, called Noble Shield. And that is the effort to support Ukraine and to support Ukraine's sovereignty and to push back against the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by Putin and Russian military. So I just wanted to lift those folks up to you. They're doing well. They know what their mission is. And I look forward to all of them coming home safely. And now on to the issue at hand. Thanks for the invite. I always say you can't have a big league economy with little league infrastructure. And what we did last year in passing the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was a big league investment in the nation's economy, into creating good jobs and supporting economic growth and economic recovery, and importantly, building a cleaner and greener transportation network. It's about in Washington State, about $1.9 billion over 5 years will come to Washington State in formula funds for a variety of things. $385 million will go to our airports, including Payne Field, and what we jokingly called growing up Arlington International Airport in my hometown of Arlington, Washington. My Green Buses Act was included, and that means we're getting about $2.34 billion for low and zero emission bus grants for transit programs. The Green Ferries Act was included, and so that means we're directing about $250 million for a pilot initiative to purchase electric and no emission ferries nationwide, and Washington State is in a great position to take advantage of that. The language also included efforts to increase the role that the transportation workforce plays and to promote the role of the transportation workforce. As in almost every industry in this country today, there's a shortage of workers, and transportation writ large is no different, whether it's truck drivers, flight attendants, pilots, bus drivers. It doesn't make any difference what industry it is, there's a shortage. And so we're seeking to, the law seeks to increase and promote transportation as a career. We've joked that we always used to joke over the last 5 years that, this week is infrastructure week, and then we wouldn't do an infrastructure bill. And this week is infrastructure week. Well, every day in my district is now infrastructure day, every single day. Even today, as I'm sitting here in Everett, and I won't say exactly where, I don't want to give the protesters a leg up on where to come, but just outside my window, the Port of Everett is building new infrastructure on the waterfront with about $10 million of federal money to support creating jobs. And last month, the state legislature passed their Move Ahead Washington, that is, with under the leadership of our own Marco Elias from Snohomish County and Jake Fye. That bill included, let me put it that way, more than 20% of that bill was federal money from the IIJA. So already getting it put to work. There's opportunities for tribal communities as well in this bill. And I would just let everyone know my office put together a guide of these funding initiatives, and we stand ready to assist the cities and towns and counties in the North Puget Sound to help navigate the process for applying some of these funds. And maybe Paul can cover that a little bit later. Just one final note on the economy. It certainly is recovering from the pandemic. I might argue it has not fully recovered. We are enjoying very low unemployment, which is great, but we're not enjoying relatively high inflation. Inflation we haven't seen since I was growing up in the 70s and early 80s in Arlington, Washington, living with my 7 brothers and sisters and my mom and dad and one salary, one wage. So I know what families are going through right now, and it's trying to stretch those dollars, and we're doing what we can to ease supply chains to help lower costs for folks as well. So so that it's kind of a two sides of the coin on the economy. One final note on the economy, and that's the American Rescue Plan that we passed last year, included the Aviation Manufacturing Jobs Protection Act, which is a bill specifically to help preserve jobs in the aviation supply chain, not at Boeing, but all those companies that support Boeing and other airplane manufacturers around the world. We have a huge concentration here in the Pacific Northwest. That bill saved about 30,000, protected about 30,000 jobs nationwide, about 4,000 to 5,000 here in our state. So there's a lot going on in transportation. I can answer any questions y'all might have, and Paul, and if Sean shows up, they'll be around after I have to get going. Thanks, Misha.
Excellent, thank you very much. That was a wonderful start to the conversation, and I'm hoping some folks out in the audience have questions for Congressman Larson. To kick us off, I have one, and that is just, what are you most excited about in the passage of IIJA?
What I'm most excited about is that we have a transportation system that was literally funded and built in the 1950s. And the IIJA gives us a chance to repair and rebuild and rehabilitate so that we have a transportation system built for the 2050s. There is a huge investment in cleaner and greener transportation. I mentioned the Green Ferries Act, which will pull the diesel emissions, help our ferry systems pull diesel emissions out of the air, while also taking advantage of this innovative technology and electrifying our ferry fleet. Same with transit. We have Everett Transit here is electrifying its fleet. Wacom Transit up in Bellingham Community transit is going to do a feasibility study on what routes work best for them for community transit or electric transit. And there are a variety of other areas in the bill that are helping us turn that corner to think about what and to act on what a transportation system built in the 2050s that is cleaner and greener can look like. We didn't think about that in the 1950s. We need to think about it now so that when we come out the end of this, we have a transportation system that is better for our environment while also creating jobs.
Wonderful. And as folks are getting their brains ticking, I do have another one here for you. I know sometimes it's a little slow to start in the mornings, but we'll roll with it. What is one thing that you feel like, or I guess it doesn't have to be one thing, but as we're looking toward the future, that 2050 package, what comes next? I know that there's a ton of money here, and that a lot of folks will work on chewing that up for the next couple of decades. But looking to the future, what do you anticipate?
I think there are two areas. One is a little nearer and dear to my heart because I'm the chair of the aviation subcommittee in Congress, and we have to rewrite the federal aviation bill next year. And in that bill, we need to lay a foundation for what aviation looks like in the future. There's a lot going on in the Pacific Northwest on electric aviation, potential hydrogen propulsion for aviation as well. And the market right now for what we call eVTOL or electric vehicle takeoff and lift, get it all down, basically flying taxis. It's very real. It's no longer the Jetsons. It's actually very real. And how we plan for that, how our local airports plan for that, how transportation planners plan for increased use of the airspace is going to be an extremely important challenge, a riddle a little bit to answer, as well as great opportunity. The second thing I think is we need to continue to think more about equity in transportation, how to connect communities that were otherwise not connected to the broader communities, how to reconnect communities that transportation investments split up in the past. And transportation investments can really help tie communities together. In the past, sometimes our transportation investments deliberately separated communities. And I don't think we can get away with that, because not only because it's wrong, but I think long-term, the challenges that we face in the global economy, where we're going to need to better connect our communities so people can get to and from work easier, more efficiently, it's going to be an economic imperative as well. So meeting that moral and economic imperative in the future is going to be a critical part of investment.
Absolutely. And this might be a question for technical staff, but if you feel up for it, who's developing these flying cars?
Who's developing these flying cars? There are about 200 plus separate companies right now that say they're involved in eVTOL. Some of them are real and doing real things. Some of them are on paper, and some of them are I'll just say that some of them are bad investments as well. It's a hot thing that people want to get into, but there are some very real companies. I don't want to get into the names because I don't want to miss any and come across as I'm supporting any one of them. I'm not, or any five of them. But I think in the next, what year is it now? It's still 2022. In the next year and a half, you will see the Federal Aviation Administration certify 1, 2, and maybe 3 separate platforms, separate eVTOL or flying taxis for commercial use. And it'll be very exciting, but one of the challenges we're going to face is to ensure that flying taxis don't become something that people who can afford it do. How we integrate them into a transportation system for public broader use is still a question we have to answer, but it's very real.
How exciting! The future is now.
It is. Yeah.
And eVTOL is an abbreviation for
electric vehicle takeoff and lift.
Excellent. We love abbreviations in this world.
We hate them in Congress because we have enough of them.
Love hate.
Exactly.
So we have 1 minute left. Oh, looks like there is one last question here, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Is there any effort legislatively to help some of the immigrants into the US where there are labor shortages? So thinking about workforce.
Well, there's a lot of things to think about workforce. It's one area in the Infrastructure Jobs Investment Act. Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. There's a specific provisions to tie apprenticeship training to some of the investments that we make. So we're building the next generation workforce. We need to do that now. With regards to the specific question, it's a broader issue wrapped up in an immigration reform, which I support. But there's nothing specifically except for maybe how the agricultural workforce, how we address the needs in the ag workforce specifically. But beyond that, it'll take more than a minute. Rebecca Wolf asked that question from Snohomish County PD. Take longer than that to really get into it too deeply.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time this morning, Congressman Larson. I wish you a wonderful day out in the world, and yeah, we're so grateful for your time here today.
Sure, thanks. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank my partner in Snohomish County, Susan DelBene, as well, for all her great efforts on trade and on transportation. And we will be together later today at Community Transit to cut the ribbon on the new Swift Orange line, a big one of the milestones in transit in Snohomish County today. So we'll see you then, Susan. Thanks.
See you later.
Thanks. And with that, I would like to welcome the wonderful Congresswoman Susan DelBene, who represents Washington's 1st congressional district, spanning Northeast King County all the way to the Canadian border, including parts of King, Snohomish, Skagit, and Whatcom counties. She currently serves as vice chair on the House Ways and Means Committee and as chair of the Forward Thinking New Democrat Coalition. She is a leader on issues of technology, healthcare, trade, as the Congressman mentioned, taxes, environmental conservation, and agriculture, and is a champion for working families. With that, Congresswoman DelBene, would you like to give us a few of your opening remarks?
Absolutely. Thanks, Misha. And good morning, everyone. Hopefully everyone's had their coffee now. First, I just wanted to point out in the panel later, Shanta from my office, Shanta Ginwave, does all of the transportation infrastructure work in my office in DC. And so she'll be here to answer any questions that might have too. A couple things that Congressman Larson that I wanted to highlight that he didn't have a chance to cover. Broadband, one of the big parts of the infrastructure legislation is broadband, and this is from so many perspectives, from economic opportunity, from equity standpoint, in order to have access to healthcare, to great education, to job opportunities. We need broadband, and broadband meaning being able to do what we're doing right now from all over the county. We know we can't right now. We've got places that don't have broadband or even good cell service right now as you head out Highway 530 or Highway 2. So the $100 million for Washington State, at least, to expand broadband, and we need to make sure that we have that access everywhere. So I know Snohomish County has done a good job of mapping. That's been a critical part. Making sure we really fill those gaps is knowing where we've got coverage, where we've got good coverage, where we've got okay coverage, and where we've got no coverage. So those resources are incredibly important. The bill also has money for wildfires, $39 million for Washington State Protect Against Wildfires. Very, very important. Since I kind of represent almost from I-5 East on in Snohomish County, we know fires are an important issue, and water, not only clean water, but also funding for culverts and all of the infrastructure work that's necessary to make sure that we have water flowing correctly, and keeping our roads stronger, and also helping with fish passage. So those are other areas that are really important, that are part of when we talk about infrastructure, more than just the transportation side of things, that I think are important for everyone to remember. Also, there are many competitive grants as part of the legislation, some new ones happening. And then we also passed our fiscal year 22 funding bill that provided additional funds as well for grants to support infrastructure. I was just in Granite Falls recently, where Bridge 102 is now got $22 million to be replaced. This is a bill that the road that goes up to the Mountain Loop Highway. There's a lot of industrial traffic that flows through there, but also a lot of tourism as folks go up the Mountain Loop. Being able to replace that bridge, which is 88 years old, is so important, and funding came through a RAISE grant. So I encourage everyone also to keep in mind the competitive grants that are available that might be important for specific projects that folks are looking at. And this is one that I know the county had applied for a while, and we're happy to see not only that money come through, but the largest RAISE grant that we've seen here. So very, very important. And when we look at infrastructure, I think it's important, and Congressman Larson referred to this a bit too, that we're building infrastructure for the next 50 years, not the infrastructure we built for the last 50 years. So addressing resiliency, addressing issues of climate, addressing issues, as he said, of equity as well, using the resources and technologies we have to make sure that we're building infrastructure that will serve us well long into the future. So we have a great opportunity there. Electrification, another example. So we're also working on our FY23 budget right now. So I said we passed FY22, that started last October, but the legislation didn't pass till March. Not a good way to fund. I hope we get this funding bill done before the fiscal year starts, which is October 1st. So we're working on fiscal year 23 to make sure we have strong funding again for many of these programs that are helpful to keep projects moving forward. So let me stop there, and Misha, I'll turn over to you for any questions.
All right, thank you for that. So I have one to kick us off, but it looks like everybody's coffee kicked in a little bit. So we'll go to the audience first, and Chris will do your question after infrastructure. Great. Okay. And yeah, so Stargate satellite internet. Is the Congresswoman familiar with this broadband, and just curious on different technologies as we're thinking about broadband and environmental issues?
Yeah, so when we look at broadband, we have to look at all the different types of technologies that are available. The key things are making sure that people have affordable connectivity, and that connectivity allows them to do what we're doing. And I say that because I think it's important that we recognize what a minimum bar of acceptable services for education, for economic opportunities in your job, for example, or for telehealth. And so there are satellite services that can provide service. In many cases, we have challenges as we get into the mountains with line of sight. And so we need to look at other technologies that are available too. And affordability can be key. There are services that are available that are not affordable. So all of that's going to be important as we make sure that we provide service. So I think that's something I know the county has looked into. We know that, for example, at the Oso landslide wiped out the kind of one piece of fiber running up Highway 530. We know that we want to make sure that we have resiliency, and we don't have places where we can wipe out communications so easily. So I think that's something else that we need to look at. So there are different types of technologies that can be used. Clearly, we should look at all of those, what's appropriate, the goal being great service, a great affordable service throughout the county and throughout the country.
Excellent. And another question from Timothy Carr: how will the Infrastructure Act positively affect tourism and corporate travel into the area?
First of all, as I was talking about, for example, the bridge to the Mountain Loop in Granite Falls, making sure that we have access for folks into, we have I say I represent the most beautiful district in the country. Mount Baker, Snoqualmie is part of that. We've got to be able to make sure, for example, our forest roads, other areas, sometimes they've been washed out. I talked about culverts. We've had issues. You go out towards Index where we lost a whole road that got washed out. There's a big project out Index Galena Road to fix that. So not only is that important for communities and folks who live there, but it's also important for folks wanting to access our beautiful areas for hiking or other recreational activity. So that's important. The other thing I've been working on infrastructure is high-speed rail, work to make sure that we have high-speed rail from Portland up to Vancouver, BC. We know that if folks have opportunities to be able to move throughout the Cascadia region, the Cascadia corridor, that can be really instrumental in people being able to move throughout a region for tourism, but also for commuting for work or to see family. That's obviously a big effort, but we are leading the effort to continue to make sure that we are looking at opportunities for high-speed rail and investment in terms of being able to make sure we're looking at planning. And this has been a joint effort across the region, including with folks in British Columbia.
Excellent. So I want to make sure that we get to all of the questions, but I do have one infrastructure question before we go to the others. And this is just my own curiosity, but wondering about any potential conversations on a federal level for how we pay for transportation projects in the future.
Yeah, so this how we pay for everything. I'm on the Ways and Means Committee, so so that's important when we look at revenues. I think when we look at transportation infrastructure, the talk of funding is important, and I think we get a great return. So we've got to look at the investment that way. Clearly, we have the dollars that we regularly see going into the Highway Trust Fund. There are dollars that come in from things like the gas tax. There's ongoing efforts to look at alternatives to that, like vehicle miles traveled, because of the decline in revenues from a gas tax, kind of by design. As we move more and more towards electrification, you'll see that change too. So I think that, and part of the programs that we put together, for example, the competitive grants, et cetera, a lot of this also comes down to how we put the appropriate tax policy in place to make sure we have long-term funding and stable funding. I think one thing that's very important, and I'd say this in many areas, not just in issues of kind of infrastructure broadly, these are not projects that start and finish generally in a short period of time. Some of the important projects we do go over many years. If you look at all that's happening with light rail, these are long-term investments that we're making to make a long-term difference. And so we have to make sure there's stable long-term funding so that these projects can continue to move forward and we can really make the transformational investments that are so important. So that means strong, stable tax policy too. And I think that's got to be a key part of kind of how we look at investments writ large, obviously infrastructure being part of that too. And can I just add one more thing? And when we talk about infrastructure, and someone might have someone put something I didn't read about housing. Another key part of infrastructure throughout our region is affordable housing. And as I was talking about tax policy, I've been leading the effort in the House, Senator Cantwell in the Senate on the affordable housing tax credit to make sure that we have the right financing available to help support more investment in affordable housing throughout our region, throughout the country. Everywhere in the country, not just urban areas, but rural areas, our tribal communities are struggling with affordable housing. So these investments are going to be critically important too. And as we look at long-term strong investments, it's this combination of looking at housing, how housing is co-located with opportunities for transit, and really doing long-term community planning in terms of how things work together. So I think that's very, very important and another key piece when we talk about these critical investments and how all these policies tie together.
Wonderful. So I think we have, it's funny, the questions just started rolling in right at the end of our little time here, but we will have time with technical staff at the end of this as well. But I do have one final question for you, Congresswoman, and then if you would like to provide some closing remarks.
Okay.
So in thinking about stormwater solutions and the Endangered Species Act, Section 7 compliance, which I'm not familiar with, but I'm guessing you are. What support can be provided to help deliver timely transportation improvements in the changing science of saving salmon?
Well, I'll do the quick overview and I'll let folks go into the long-term detail there too. We have this beautiful region with incredible natural resources. And one of the things we also need to remember is as we look at kind of long-term infrastructure too, what we do to protect those resources. I met with the Army Corps recently, and we were talking about consultations with respect to Endangered Species Act. We also talk about the importance of thinking through our water, what we do to look at resilience. We've seen in, large amounts of flooding throughout our region too, especially in my district up north in Whatcom and Skagit counties. So when we're looking at kind of long-term infrastructure, what does it mean to kind of build resilient infrastructure given the challenges that we've seen throughout our region now and the opportunities that we have to protect our salmon, to provide better habitat and better kind of consistent flows, look at issues of temperature in terms of shading, et cetera. All of these are going to be critically important. So I say that when we look any individual project, I think we have to look at these things. And one thing that many of you and regional leaders have talked about is how important that it is that we look at this regionally. If you look at flows, for example, for our rivers, and you want to talk about impact on salmon, we have to look from the headwaters all the way down and really think through what policies we're putting together and understand the decisions that are made throughout the region. Fixing one culvert, for example, may be helpful one place, but if we don't really think through kind of how that's going to work kind of consistently throughout the region, you may end up having challenges in other places. So anyway, but in terms of specifics on the bill and oversight going forward, I'll let you take that up with staff going forward here.
Thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your time this morning with us, Congresswoman. This has been a great conversation, and we're really appreciative of you taking a little time.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. And it looks like we have a little sun out there right now, so enjoy that. Take care.
Yes, you too.
Bye-bye.
And Annette, could we please have Shanta spotlighted, so we're spotlit? Good.
Absolutely. Give me just 1 second.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have quite a few questions that have fallen in the laps of our wonderful staff here. As somebody who's worked for elected officials previously, I know that staff, you all are the ones who really get it done. We love our Congress people, but so a couple of questions for you here. First, I'm guessing, I'm not familiar. Let's see, are there any conceptual conversations about taxing kWh for cars to support roads? Are you familiar with that term? If not, I might have somebody let us know what that abbreviation means. No. I believe that question came from Matt Smith. Electric hours, kilowatt hours. Gotcha. Yep. Any conversations on kilowatt hours?
So I can start and then Paul can maybe jump in too. I personally have not heard any conversations. I know broadly there's been conversations, as the Congressman talked about making sure we have a sustainable funding source for the Highway Trust Fund, but I think a lot of the conversation has been more on road usage fees like BMT. I haven't heard any conversations around taxing kilowatt hours, but we'll let Paul chime in if he's maybe heard anything.
No, I haven't. I have had conversations with, over the years, actually, with the State Highway Commission representatives. But it's all been discussions in terms of vehicle miles traveled or some kind of, I call it the utility funding model, some kind of fees that are paid as systems access and then fees that are paid in terms of usage. They break down into two different groups, but basically it's vehicle miles traveled. And I think the focus is if we're going to decarbonize the transportation system, then we clearly have to move to some sources other than gas tax funding.
Thank you both for that. Another question. So thinking about the logistics of IIJA, has there been any talk of oversight? Has it oversight begun? And if so, what has that looked like so far?
Yeah, so I know a lot of the different committees have been holding hearings to talk about the different provisions within IIJA that fall within different committees' jurisdictions. So I know the Congressman recently participated in one with Ways and Means. And so I think, as more and more funds start rolling out the door, those conversations will continue to pick up. But, committees are definitely have been engaging since we passed the bill.
Yeah, it is happening. It's probably worth noting that the implementation of the act is really still pretty new. So for instance, in Washington State, the passage of the Move Ahead Washington Act just took place within the last month. And so learning how to and how these funds are being implemented is still pretty new. That said, we are so as they say, we are taking notes. And my understanding is that there may be some kind of hearings to begin to look at that process as early as this summer.
Excellent. And a question from Councilmember Dunn. At the county, we have prevailing wage requirements and apprentice utilization requirements. Are there similar things wrapped up in this federal legislation?
I do believe that most of, if not all of the IIJA provisions are subject to Davis-Bacon requirements. And if there are questions on specific programs too that may have, more or less specific requirements, we're happy to follow up. I'll drop my email in the chat too, so everyone has it. I don't cover labor issues for the office, but I'm happy to pass those questions along to our labor staffer too, to make sure that for any specific programs you're looking at, we can get you answers.
Yeah, and I would just add to what Shonda said, those provisions were in existence in federal law before IIJA was passed, and they were not changed that I'm aware of in any way by IIJA, so they still apply.
Thank you. And another question, obviously, the state of Washington recently passed our Move Ahead Washington transportation package. We had $210 million in there for planning and design of the US 2 trestle. I hear there's a mega projects grant in the IIJA. Could that potentially fully fund the US 2 trestle?
I think in terms of this year, probably not, only because these projects tend to go in steps. And the next steps for US 2 would be the planning and engineering work and that development work. However, those funds are available, and I understand will be spent, and when and how they will be spent will then inform the options to fully fund that project in some subsequent funding in future years. So, you think of these things as steps. The next step is do the planning, engineering, and permitting and have the project ripe for fully funding. And I think that's pretty exciting. I know all of us are hopeful that can move it forward as fast as possible.
Yeah, I know both of our bosses have been very, very active in trying to get funding there. And so, we are looking forward to pursuing any and all avenues there. I would just add to what Paul said in that, I believe it's like a $5 billion program. And my understanding is the cost of the trestle for the full project is maybe somewhere around $2 billion. And so that's something to keep in mind just in terms of all of the applications that are going to come into the mega program across the country. But I think absolutely breaking it into smaller chunks and finding, a piece of it that can move forward within the next few years and potentially putting that forward for funding is definitely something to consider.
And thinking about workforce equity a bit, Congressman Larson mentioned that. How will these funds, we've been having conversations amongst ourselves, thinking about how we're going to support workforce equity and curious how the logistics are going to work, how that money will flow, if it's something that will go through like Department of Commerce, or if it will be passed down through workforce councils. So curious how workforce equity plays into the IIJA.
It's probably important to see it as different pieces go through different agencies, but each of them have an equity piece. And in many cases, they're still developing and making those equity pieces a richer process. So, in the transportation world, I'm more familiar with that than some others. But those dollars go through federal processes to the state processes. But the equity pieces are important, not just in terms of contracts and contractors having a greater women minority business representation, for instance, in those contracting processes, but also in what's built, because what's built provides access to people so that they can get to their jobs and get to work and so on in something other than a single occupant vehicle. And so that is, the concern is that those systems are available to all people, and they're serving areas, particularly underserved areas, and that gets into part of the mix. I think we're fortunate here in that the Puget Sound Regional Council has made equity a critical piece, and many of you on this call know that these dollars flow through the state of Washington to what are called the RTPOs, Regional Transportation Planning Organizations, and Puget Sound Regional Council is that organization for the Puget Sound region. So that work is being done, and I'm pretty excited about what they are doing for equity. So when it gets to the ground, that's how the equity lens, that's how and where the equity lens is applied.
And I'll just add a couple additional comments there too. So I know that in a lot of the existing formula fund programs, the eligibility has been broadened to include different workforce development programs as categories of what those funds can be used for. And so there's definitely opportunities there. And I know that equity is a huge consideration for the administration and all of the conversations and briefings that we've had with the agencies about implementation of the IIJA. They've emphasized, especially for these competitive grant programs, that equity is going to be a strong consideration for them. So I think it definitely is at the forefront for everyone.
Let me also add that we are working directly with our tribal communities throughout our districts. We've had already several meetings, for instance, with the Tulalipes, and we're looking at the application of these funds there, and the question not only of transportation, but of broadband, of culverts, of protection of usual and accustomed fishing rights, of things that are important to those communities are part of that equity piece as well.
Yeah, that kind of leads me to my next question here of how can local governments best position themselves for success? I hear equity, and I'm guessing there's some level of green and cleanness going on, but curious how people can set themselves up for success when applying for competitive grants.
The first part of it, if we look at the different pieces, the transportation piece is the one that has gotten the most attention simply because the funding has moved more rapidly than in some of the other categories. So the sort of the good news of that is that the existing formulas are really in place. They aren't fundamentally changed by IIJA. Rather, the act provides more resources through which that flow through those existing formulas. So that's underway. Those jurisdictions are not having to wonder, how do we apply? They are already in a sense, in many cases, they're already in the queue. The other areas are still unfolding. For instance, we just concluded the deadline for application for the RISE grant programs, which are, we used to call them Tiger grants. And so those projects have just come forward. A challenge that we have identified even before the act was completed, and certainly in implementation, you asked the question earlier about having hearings on implementation. The tough part is smaller jurisdictions just simply don't have the resources that the larger ones do, and they are clearly at a disadvantage in terms of accessing the funds. So I know we, and I'm sure Representative DelBene is the same, doing much the same, because we're working together on some projects that are cross-jurisdictional. We're trying to help those jurisdictions, in a sense, supplement or provide some additional staff support. They're challenged to get these funds. And then lastly, the different programs, whether it's drinking water or high-speed rail or clean energy or so on, they're going through those administrative agencies. And we're only now seeing what we call in the business NOFOs, which is notice of funding opportunities that come out from those agencies. So we're all paying close attention to those. And once we see them, then we try to let local jurisdictions know about them and try to help them answer questions and give them some support.
Paul did a wonderful job there, a very thorough answer. Just a few additional things. I would say as you're putting together grant applications, taking a look at the administration's Justice 40 initiative. Again, that's something that has been brought up a lot in conversations with agencies, and I think is something that is criteria they're going to be considering as they evaluate some of these competitive grant applications. And to Paul's point, we're here to help however we can. We want to see you get these funds just as much as you do. And so our Rachel Alger just had to jump off the call to staff the Congresswoman in another meeting, but she's our Snohomish County outreach liaison. I'm sure many of you have worked with her, but she also is our grants coordinator and is able to work with you in considering whether we're able to provide letters of support for grant applications you're putting forward. Please reach out and let us know what you all are working on, what you have in the pipeline. I know we've had some of these conversations with you all already, but we're happy to reach out to agencies if there are questions or concerns as you're working on those, that we can kind of be helpful. Really anything we can do to support you through this process, we want to do.
And that's great. Let me add that Jessica Korbman is the Snohomish County liaison person for Representative Larson's office. And just as Shanta described, Jessica just does a super job, and I invite you to please contact her with any questions you have.
Yes, both Jessica and Rachel are awesome. I've worked with them both, and great teams over there. So I have another question here for you both. Are there any, I guess if you could call them hidden gems in the IIJA, something that maybe people aren't as aware of, or that you wish got more recognition?
Well, that's a great question. Let me take just a quick stab. The one that I keep looking at is culverts. There's some real money there. Now, the state is, as many of you know, under federal court order, and they're, I say this with affection for their commitment, but they're certainly trying to get as much of those dollars as they can. That said, I do think there's dollars there. And so that's a big piece of it. I think, to me, the act doesn't compel, but provides for climate and resiliency. So I think whether it's electric buses, electrification of the system, I think you heard both Representatives DelBene and Larson talk about that as priority. I think we know that is a critical factor. And so putting these pieces together to look at surface water management, transportation, infrastructure impacts, electrification, and trying to look at these as tools that we can use to address the challenges of decarbonizing our transportation system and so on, I think are real opportunities, but they're going to have to be done deliberately in order to realize the promise that is within them.
So Paul stole mine, so I'll just +1 culverts. When I first started handling the T&I portfolio for the Congresswoman, I did intro meetings with everyone, and that was the #1 thing people brought up to me was culverts, culverts, culverts. And so, you know, I think that's a huge need for our community. I don't have to tell you guys that. In conversations that, you know, I've had with the state, because I know the state is going to be competing for some of this money as well as our locals. You know, I think they're interested in finding opportunities where projects could potentially be bundled together. So if there's, you know, a local project in the same area that the state is looking to also work on, you know, there might be an opportunity to submit a joint application and make that a more competitive application. And so my understanding is that the state is getting, or Washoe is getting some of that information through the Salmon Recovery Office. And so just making sure that folks at the state level are aware of what your culvert needs are and what your projects are. So as they start to figure out what they might want to put forward, they're also aware of your needs there. And we can help, you know, pass along that information and connect you to folks too as well. And then the other program too, I don't think this is really a hidden gem. I think like culverts, it's one that everyone's really excited about, but you know, I think Washington is such a leader in clean energy. And I think there's, you know, I've seen some of the comments in the chat too about EVs. There's a lot of great money in here for EV charging infrastructure. There's both formula dollars, which I think is hugely important for Washington State as we build out our network, but there's also competitive grant funding. And I know a lot of our cities and other folks are really interested in building out their local networks and connections as well. And so I think that's another really great program where there is opportunity for us to continue leading the way.
Yeah, I would be remiss. That's great. And I would be remiss if I didn't say it's not a hidden gem. It's pretty much out in the open, but the transportation funding to move to systems to decarbonize, and it's right there. It's not hidden, but there's real dollars on the table, and it's exciting that both our bosses have moved to the work to dedicate the Orange Line, and hats off to all who've been involved in that.
We are so excited to see that Orange Line come through. So one more question in the chat: since many roads and infrastructure coexist with utilities, how is that engagement? Is that happening with utilities to help develop a better solution?
You know, it is, but I think that's probably an example of where there are also challenges, because, and then the culverts are one that I've certainly seen, where we are replacing a culvert, and that often means replacing a section of a road. Well, those may or may not have utilities as a part of that, and the relationship of what is and isn't possible to be funded is really a function of the relationship that exists between the utility and the underlying property owner, which in many cases is either the state or the county for a road, for example. So that's an area where we've, I think, seen some places where it would be great to have some flexibility in that process. And another is just understanding and working with the utilities. And I think it's very positive, but understanding and working with the utilities so that as we move to transition to an electric transportation system, or one that's based more on electricity, that the utilities have the capacity to handle that change in their load structure. And so there's some real questions on the table there. And I think every one of the utilities that I'm familiar with is working on that. I mean, in other words, they're very well aware, and they're working in very positive ways to try to prepare and address that future.
And I'll add to, you know, kind of on the broadband side of things, the Congressman has been a really strong supporter of Dig Once policies, and is on, you know, a couple of pieces of legislation that would make sure that we are having close coordination as we're, you know, updating our roads to then go in and put in, you know, the broadband infrastructure that we need at the same time, so that we're not continuing to dig up roads over and over and over again. I think that's an example of the types of coordination that we really need to ensure are in place as we work on these projects. And I think to Paul's point, you know, the conversations we've had as well, you know, I think people are working in really close collaboration with each other.
Yes, that always makes things go significantly better. You know, teamwork makes the dream work. A little cheesy, but very true, right? So I don't have any other questions for you all, but if there's anything you would like to say to close out the conversation, the floor is yours.
I'll just thank everyone for the opportunity to engage in this conversation. It's great to see so many people so excited about infrastructure. It's not always the sexiest of topics, but it's absolutely necessary. And, you know, I put my email in the chat, happy to continue to serve as a resource. Please feel free to reach out to Paul and I, to Jessica and Rachel. We are here to kind of support you as these funds go out the door, and especially, you know, any challenges that you're experiencing, you know, that's something the Congressman always brings up. We have a way to engage with agencies that, you know, folks don't always have themselves, and so we're happy to kind of reach out to people and ask clarifying questions and make sure that if there are hurdles and roadblocks that you were experiencing, we can get those resolved right away. So thank you all again, and look forward to staying in conversation with you all.
Yeah, add my thanks to EASC and the group. So this is wonderful, and these really are, we really are in some very interesting and exciting times as we see not only this act and the promise that is within it, but we're in times of transition with regard to transportation and infrastructure, and looking at that future with a strong job base is really what this act is all about. So it's really exciting to be able to talk about that and bring these projects forward. And I know both of our bosses have worked really, really hard. People who said, well, you know, the staffs get things done. Well, they may, but they have to be directed by someone, and that direction is coming from two representatives who are very committed to this work. So that's really exciting. So thanks for having us.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you both. And thank you. Please send our thanks to Congresswoman Susan DelBene and Congressman Rick Larson. We know they have a ton happening. So really appreciate them taking a little time to spend with us. And thank you both. It's been a really great coffee chat. So it is now the time where oh, sorry, Annette, I'm terrible at this. Please join us. Come on down April 27th for our economic forecast and annual meeting featuring Marita Chang. It is going to be at the Tulalip Resort Casino at 10:30 a.m. to 2 p.m. And it is going to be a really exciting and collaborative opportunity. So please join us there. And then our next coffee chat coming up on May 3rd is Economic Recovery and Resiliency, looking at the Stillaguamish Valley Economic Redevelopment Plan after the Oso landslide. So going to be another really interesting and informative conversation coming up on May 3rd. And with that, I did it. Annette, thank you. Beverages, thank you for joining us for this week's coffee chat. I've successfully given you back 2 minutes of your time. 1 minute, I lied. So I hope you all have a wonderful Tuesday and a wonderful week. Thank you very much.